Hi, Janet. Delighted to see you today, Janet Ilieva. Um, Now, you've got your own consulting company called Education Insight, but many people will remember you from your days at the British Council or the Higher Education Funding Council for England. And it's great to see you.
Hi, Elspeth. Absolutely delighted to see you. It's been ages since we saw you last.
Yeah. So why don't you just explain a little bit about what you do in Education Insight, Janet? I think you work at quite a lot at government level across the world, I think.
Yes, interestingly, it's been quite a fascinating journey. I've been running Education Insight. It's coming to its fifth year now. And most of the work that I've been involved in has been agency level consultancy, international higher education research. But interestingly, bizarrely, transnational education, I see myself as a fairly newcomer to transnational education. I've been mainly doing it for the past 7 years or so. So with that in mind, knowing that the people I work with, they've been doing it for decades, quite a few decades.
Yeah.
I do see myself as newcomer who still discovers so many things, amazing things, surprising things.
But it must be very different to see governments in different parts of the world and what their priorities are, say.
Absolutely. I think the project is very, very close to heart, and it's been one of the most rewarding experiences was working on a British Council initiative in the Philippines with the Commission for Higher Education. And it all started, I think it was actually my first consultancy project. When I started Education Insight, serendipitously, it's still going. And at that time, there was moratorium on transnational education in the Philippines. And 5 years later, we're talking about a fairly new transnational education law that was passed at the end of last August, early September. TNA is encouraged in the country, but also the Commission for Higher Education, CHED, supports TNA programs, and they're funding it because from their point of view, it is a way to bring expertise and develop expertise. But Philippines is one of the countries that has suffered the worst brain drain over the past years. Interestingly, it's a very services-based country, but one of the biggest contributors to GDP is remittances. Basically, all these highly skilled people working overseas. By bringing in capacity in country, what TED has actually supported is developing programs that are not currently existent in the Philippines in areas that they believe the economy is going to need in future. So it is around sustainable technologies, about food security, design education, and also natural disasters management. And these programs are collaboratively developed with UK institutions, but there is a joint collaborative input.
Okay.
And at postgraduate level, so we have several jointly developed PhD programs, and also taught master's programs, but they're collaborative. This is what makes them quite interesting, unique, and they're mainly aimed at faculty training. So these are members of staff at the Philippine institutions that are taking up these programs that may have component of them taught in the UK.
So that's the capacity building element of transnational education in a way. But I think you've mentioned that in different parts of the world it's moved on to have a different role now than perhaps the going back to its origins in the 90s or whenever it was developed.
Yes, there has been quite an interesting evolution of transnational education. For those that are not familiar with the term, transnational education means delivery of higher education outside of the country where the higher education institution is based. So it can take many shapes and forms. One of the traditional shapes is building a branch campus or an outpost in a different country, but it can be delivered online, or there are other means through, let's say, local institution delivers a program developed by an overseas partner through the means of validation or franchising by licensing. So basically the program is licensed locally. But also we have collaborative forms of transnational education where the academic program is jointly developed. And in that sense, we have dual and double degrees that are awarded either separately by the two institutions or joint program where the program actually has the two names of the higher education providers that developed it.
You mentioned, I think that the quite often universities sometimes go into these partnerships with kind of short-term expectations, but it's really a long-term collaboration that's needed. Do you think we're getting better?
I can't agree more with you. I think that the temptation for institutions to be involved in transnational education is that it widens, is a significant contributor to their market share. Traditionally, if we look at global student mobility, it is the most affluent students that have the financial means to go and study abroad. So looking at UNESCO data, traditionally over the past 40 years, only 2% of the local enrollments or locally enrolled learners can afford to study overseas. But transnational education equips the institutions with the means to tap into the remaining 98%. I'm borrowing this from Nigel Healy because he was the first one to observe it. The TNE gives you the means to tap into much bigger student pool. So in a sense, by providing more cost-effective means of education, institutions can basically widen their global reach. They can engage with students who don't have the economic means to travel, but yet they have the academic ability to do higher education degree.
It's not just the economic means. I think I remember when I was doing a study on employability for around transnational education. We were looking at the nature of the student body. For example, it can be a very different target group of students. They could be in work, full-time work effectively, and doing the study at a different time. They may have caring responsibilities, so they can't travel elsewhere. So it's not just an economic issue, is it?
No, it's a much a broader proportion of the population. As you say, they may have caring family responsibilities, work commitments, or other commitments that are keeping them in their country of residence. As such, I guess TNE widens these means of engagement to not just the students that economically can't afford it, but also young adults that have other commitments in countries. And also it's very, I think this is the aspect of transnational education that interests me quite a lot, is that many countries still have fairly regimented higher education structures when school leavers, if they don't go into higher education straight away, it's very difficult for them to reconnect with education in their always employees. And TNE is there to tap onto that, I guess, this segment of the workforce that is finding it very difficult to go through the traditional route of higher education.
Getting a second chance to have the opportunity. Yeah.
Yes, and it can. Sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, that for some time, well, maybe some time ago, I could be well out of date on this, but there were also seen as negative sides of transnational education, in a sense of kind of the global north bringing their curriculum to the global south, as it were, and so on. But I think we've moved on a bit from there, have we?
I think these forms, some of them will also stay as far as there is market demand. for such forms of degrees. But yes, I agree, there has been a significant shift from this standalone higher education provision to more mutually designed programs and curricula where the two institutions come together to deliver a program which is locally relevant, locally embedded, and where perhaps the local partner has a significant contribution to the course because it is designed to the students that are in their care.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really pleased to hear you say this kind of progress is being made. And the local requirements are, even though it may be capacity building, there's a collaboration in designing the program for the local needs. That's great. Now another thing I know that's close to your heart is sustainability, and I think you see transnational education as a real opportunity in terms of issues around the environment and so on. So perhaps you could say something about that.
Yes, it is an interest that I have to admit was part of my contribution to one of the CANI discussions that Elsa Lemon from Australia started, and I think she's doing a phenomenal job in that space.
Yeah.
And I have to admit that as many professionals in international higher education, I don't feel particularly good about my carbon footprint. And all the travel, as much as I enjoyed it and loved and all the connections made, but I think there are better, more sustainable means to engage internationally. And this is why I think transnational education has unutilized potential to support institutions with their carbon footprint. And I do think that this is probably one of the unintended and to a degree cathartic processes that's probably happening on the back of COVID, where institutions can travel or professionals can travel the way they used to. And a lot of the work that is happening in the T&E space is happening online. Many of the quality assurance practices, examination boards, they're all happening online. And I do hope practices like that will stay in future. But also T&E means working together with trusted partners. And when you have trusted partner on the ground, I think that the relationship in that sense is based on mutuality and on trust. And
that's a bit more difficult to develop when you're on a Zoom call, for example. But you're absolutely right. Maybe we're just getting used to it now, and we'll get better at that.
And especially, I guess, in time obviously will show whether face-to-face meetings are something from the past. But I do think that we are moving from one extreme to another, and there is a middle way that is likely to be the sustainable way.
Well, you and I first met in Australia many years ago.
It's interesting to bring that on a conversation about.
We're probably the worst people to talk about this, but I agree with you. And that was at a conference. It was the Australian International Education Conference, and the interesting thing is how conferences may change as a result of this as well. But I think you're absolutely right about those relationships being developed. Now, in those days, you were very much involved in big data collection and discussion, and I think that's maybe a little bit less of your role at the moment. But do you think big data is helpful for international education?
Yes, as given my background, I love my data. It's my comfort zone. It helps me think in a way. It's always, I guess, there is a great comfort when you see the numbers. You know exactly where you stand. When you see human emotions, it's a little bit harder to make a judgment call about what the next step should be. So I'm still heavily on the data side. However, the more I work with data, the more I realize that good data, there isn't so much of it. if one has a well-defined question, the data can sharpen one's focus.
Mm.
But the clearer the focus is, or the clearer the question is, the more one realizes that the big data is not that big out there. We are actually looking at very small relevant information that can support one's decision making.
And
But
yet we can tend to rely on the sort of quantitative data, which can lead us down a certain path. And I think institutional leaders seem to like to know, you know, the numbers, don't they? Whereas, in fact, a lot of international education, really, in terms of the values and the cooperation and so on, is more perhaps qualitative in what we should be looking at. But we're not asking those
absolutely,
questions either, I don't think, not very well.
yes, absolutely. I think that there is a great deal of obsession with data, but one always has to be mindful of what the data is actually telling us and how misleading it can be. And a good example, I believe, is not just university leaders, but economists and countries. Everybody's obsessed, for example, with measurements like GDP per capita and whether that's a good indicator of how successful the economy has been. But drawing on our earlier conversation, GDP doesn't include depletion of natural resources. It doesn't include environmental impact. It doesn't include the well-being of the nation or the health state of the nation. And in that sense, I think just working with data too much, I've increasingly become aware of its limitations.
Okay.
And that it's this qualitative aspect that you mentioned is the one that actually brings the data to life and highlights whether it's relevant or not.
And that's why stories like your own are very interesting in the way you describe what you're doing. But it's been really interesting talking to you today, Janet. So lovely to see you again. Thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope we'll physically see each other again soon.
I very much hope so, yes.
Thank you.
Lovely to talk, thank you.